What the hell do you think you're doing in my bed? Edward Hawthorne's voice was not a sound. It was a physical force, a hammer blow that shattered the fragile, exhausted stillness of the master bedroom. He stood in the grand doorway, his tall, imposing frame rigid with a disbelief so profound it was carved into every hard, unforgiving line of his face. Rainwater from the storm he'd just driven through dripped from the hem of his cashmere overcoat, pooling on the antique Persian rug. But he didn't seem to notice. All of his attention, a laser focus honed in years of ruthless corporate negotiations, was locked on the impossible, infuriating scene before him. A woman in his bed, his late wife's bed, and nestled on either side of her, finally, impossibly, asleep, were his sons. The woman shot up from the mattress, her movement a jolt of pure adrenalized shock. It was the new nanny, the one the agency had sent over last week, the latest in a long, failed procession of them. Lena Williams. Her heart hammered against her ribs, her eyes wide not with guilt, but with a stunned, cornered fear. The twin boys, Ethan and Eli, lay curled on either side of where she had been, their faces soft and slack, with a depth of sleep Edward hadn't seen on them in over a year. Their breathing was deep and even. The worn, one-eyed teddy bear, clutched in Ethan's arms, rose and fell in a steady, peaceful rhythm. "I can explain, Mr. Hawthorne," Lena said, her voice a quiet, trembling whisper, desperate not to wake the boys. Her hands lifted slightly, a gesture of placation, of calm. They were scared. The storm. Eli started crying, and then Ethan got a nosebleed. Edward didn't let her finish. His world, already fractured by grief, had just been violated in the most intimate way imaginable. This space was sacred, a shrine to a memory he was failing to protect. "I don't care what excuse you have," he snarled, his voice a low, dangerous growl. He strode forward, his fury a palpable wave. And then he did something he would replay in his mind for months. A moment of unforgivable, grief-fueled violence. His palm came down fast, a sharp, shocking crack echoing off the high, vaulted ceilings as it struck her cheek. Lena staggered back, a small, sharp gasp escaping her lips, one hand flying to her face. She didn't cry out. She didn't scream. She didn't even speak. Her wide, stunned eyes just locked on his, the shock of the blow overshadowed by the sheer, uncomprehending hurt in them. The physical pain was a fire on her skin, but the look in his eyes was a deeper, colder wound. "You are fired," Edward growled, the words tasting like poison in his mouth. "Get out of my house, now." She stood still for a moment, her hand pressed to her throbbing cheek, her body trembling slightly as she tried to steady her breath. Her voice, when it came, was low, almost a whisper, yet it carried an unbearable weight of dignity. "They begged me not to leave them, sir. They were terrified. I stayed in here because they were finally calm. Finally safe." "I said, 'Get out,'" he repeated, his voice flat and final, refusing to acknowledge her words, refusing to see the truth in them. Lena's gaze drifted down to the boys, still sleeping so deeply, so peacefully, as if the shadows that had haunted their every waking and sleeping moment had finally, mercifully, lifted. She leaned over, her movements slow and deliberate, and gently, reverently, kissed the top of Eli's head, then Ethan's. No words, no fanfare, just a silent, heartbreaking farewell. And then she stepped away from the bed, picked up her worn-out sneakers from the floor, and walked past Edward Hawthorne without another word, her head held high. He didn't stop her. He didn't apologize. Downstairs, Mrs. Keller, The longtime housekeeper and the stoic, silent heart of the Hawthorne estate turned as Lena descended the grand, curved staircase. The angry red mark blooming on Lena's cheek spoke volumes, a stark, violent testament to the storm that had just broken upstairs. The older woman's eyes, which had seen 3 generations of Hawthornes, widened in shock and a deep, simmering anger. Lena said nothing. She just gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of her head and continued toward the servants' exit. Outside, the rain had softened to a cold, persistent drizzle. Lena stepped into the gray, indifferent afternoon, pulled her thin coat tighter around her shoulders, and began the long, lonely walk toward the main gate. Back upstairs, Edward stood in the master bedroom, his breathing hard and ragged, the adrenaline of his rage slowly receding, leaving a cold, hollow space in its wake. He looked at the bed again, his jaw tight with a self-righteousness that was already beginning to feel fragile. And then something registered. It was the quiet. Not the tense, anxious quiet of sleeping children holding nightmares at bay, but a deep, profound, and utterly unfamiliar peace. He moved closer to the bed, drawn by an instinct he didn't understand. Ethan's brow was smooth. There was no tossing, no fretful whispering, no sheen of cold sweat. Eli's thumb was tucked in his mouth, a habit he'd had since his mother's death. But his other hand, usually clenched into a tight fist, was resting on the blanket, open and relaxed. They were truly, deeply asleep, not drugged into submission, not exhausted by hours of crying, just asleep. His throat tightened. 14 nannies in 12 months. A rotating cast of child psychologists, behavioral therapists, sleep specialists. Thousands of dollars spent on consultations that yielded nothing but clinical, useless advice. An endless siege of screaming fits, of inconsolable night terrors, of a grief so vast and sharp, it had stolen his sons' childhoods. And yet, this quiet, soft-spoken stranger, in a single night, had managed what none of them had. She had brought them peace, and he had struck her for it. He sank down onto the edge of the bed, the mattress still holding the faint warmth of her body, and dropped his head into his hands. Shame, a feeling he hadn't truly felt since he was a boy, bled into his chest like ink in water, cold and irreversible. On the nightstand, next to a framed photo of his late wife, Rebecca, a single sheet of paper lay folded once, a note. He opened it with trembling fingers. "If you can't stay for them, at least don't push away the ones who will." It wasn't signed. He read it twice, then a third time, the simple, elegant script, a scalpel to his soul. His reflection in the nearby antique mirror looked back at him, a stranger with haunted eyes, a man so hardened by grief, so suffocated by his need for control, that he had become a monster in his own home. Down the hall, Mrs. Keller stood watching from the doorway, her arms crossed. "Sir," she said, her voice soft but laced with steel. She didn't touch a single thing in here that wasn't one of the boys. She only brought them in when little Eli's nose started bleeding from crying so hard. He didn't respond. "She stayed because they asked her to stay," the housekeeper continued, her words a quiet, relentless indictment. "That's all. They didn't ask for me. They didn't ask for the doctor. They didn't ask for anyone else. Just her." Edward looked up slowly, his eyes dark with something more than anger now, something deeper, more terrifying. It was the abyss of his own regret. Outside, the main gate of the Hawthorne estate creaked closed, the sound a final metallic sigh. And for the first time in over a year, the great silent house was truly, profoundly quiet. Not with the heavy silence of grief or the tense silence of rage, but with something else entirely. The devastating silence of a peace that had been found and then, with one brutal, unforgivable act, vanished. The house was too quiet. It wasn't the comforting, peaceful kind of quiet, like the gentle hush of the first snowfall or the soft, rhythmic turning of pages in an old, beloved book. This was a different, more malevolent silence. It was the hollow, echoing quiet of a space that has been violently emptied of something vital. A silence that felt wrong, unfinished, like a question left to hang, unanswered in a cold, empty room. Edward Hawthorne sat alone in his cavernous study, a heavy crystal glass of scotch, untouched, sitting on the polished mahogany desk beside him, its amber depths reflecting the low, melancholic light of the desk lamp. The note Lena had left rested on a leather blotter, like a final damning judgment. "If you can't stay for them, at least don't push away the ones who will." He'd read it 7 times, perhaps more. Each reading was a fresh wave of self-recrimination. Outside, dusk spread over the sprawling estate like a heavy, suffocating quilt, and the wind, carrying the scent of rain and wet earth, pressed softly against the tall, mullioned windows. Inside, his sons, the twins, still slept, blessedly oblivious to the emotional storm they'd just slept through, oblivious to the fact that the one person they had finally, tentatively, allowed into their fragile, broken world was gone. Edward leaned back in his large, imposing leather chair and rubbed his temples with the heels of his hands. His right hand stung, faintly, a ghostly, phantom ache. The memory of the slap he had delivered, the sharp, ugly crack of it, was etched not just into his skin, but into his very soul. He hadn't planned it. It wasn't who he believed himself to be. He was a man of control, of logic, of surgical precision in all things. And yet, it had happened. A single, brutal moment of misjudged, grief-fueled fury, born from a year of silent, impotent suffering and 1,000 quiet, accumulating failures. He, Edward Hawthorne, a pillar of the community, a man whose name was synonymous with integrity and power, had hit a woman. And not just any woman. A woman who had been trying to heal his children. He stood up suddenly, the movement abrupt, agitated. He left the study and made his way up the grand, sweeping staircase, his footsteps echoing in the unnatural stillness. The hallway outside the boy's bedroom smelled faintly of lavender and warm cotton, a scent he now associated with her. A small, simple wooden stool sat against the wall. Lena's sketchbook was on top of it, closed neatly, its edges worn, as if she'd left it there on purpose, a final, silent piece of herself. He picked it up with a reverence he didn't understand. Inside, the pages were filled with simple, evocative drawings, rough, untrained, but overflowing with a raw, honest heart. He saw sketches of his sons, 2 small boys holding hands beneath a great ancient oak tree that stood on the estate's south lawn, a drawing of the tall, imposing house, but with too many empty, dark windows, and then a drawing that made his breath catch in his throat. It was a figure, recognizably her, sitting on the floor between the 2 boys, her arms stretched out not to hold them, but to encompass them, like protective wings. Beneath the sketch, in her neat, careful handwriting, was a short, simple caption: "The one who stays." He exhaled, a long, ragged sound, and carefully closed the sketchbook. In the nursery, Eli stirred in his sleep. Edward peeked inside. The boy rolled over, his small face untroubled, but he didn't wake. There were no nightmares, no soft, whimpering tears, just the deep, restorative sleep she had given them. He closed the door softly, his heart a heavy, aching weight in his chest. Downstairs, Mrs. Keller was folding a stack of crisp, white linen napkins in the kitchen when Edward entered. She looked up and immediately froze, her hands stilling on the linen. Something in his expression, a rawness, a vulnerability she hadn't seen since the day of Rebecca's funeral, told her to put the napkins aside. "She's gone," he said, the words simple, flat, and devastating. "I know," she replied, her voice gentle, her eyes holding no judgment, only a deep, weary sadness. "I made a mistake," he said, the words spoken almost to himself, a confession to the cold, silent room. Mrs. Keller raised her eyebrows, but her voice remained carefully neutral. "You don't say?" "She was in my bed." "She was in your room," Mrs. Keller corrected, her voice gaining a subtle but firm edge. "Because the boys wouldn't sleep anywhere else. Because the storm frightened them, and they called for her. You weren't here, Mr. Hawthorne. I was. I heard them. I heard them cry, and then I heard them beg for her. She calmed them. She did what none of the rest of us could." He pressed his lips together into a thin, hard line. "I thought—" "I know what you thought," she said, her voice softening now, filled with a deep maternal pity that was almost worse than anger. "But you weren't thinking. You were just hurting." A long, heavy silence stretched between them, thick with the ghosts of his failures. He looked at the simple wooden chair where Lena had sat during lunch only yesterday. It felt like weeks ago, a lifetime ago. "I need to find her," he said, his voice now imbued with a new, desperate resolve. Mrs. Keller didn't argue. She simply nodded. "Start with the return address on her initial application letter," she said practically. "Some small town in Georgia." He nodded, his mind already racing, already heading toward the hall, toward the possibility of atonement. Across town, in the cold, impersonal cavern of the train station, Lena sat alone on a hard plastic bench, her swollen cheek throbbing with a dull, persistent ache beneath the icy cold. She hadn't cried, not when he had screamed at her, not when his hand had struck her face, not even when she had walked past the great, imposing front gates of the estate, with nothing but her small, worn bag and the profound ache of unfinished, unacknowledged work in her chest. But now, with her thin coat wrapped tight against the damp chill, and her fingers wrapped around a lukewarm cup of vending machine coffee that tasted of plastic and despair, the tears finally, betrayingly, welled. She wiped them away quickly, angrily. Not because she was ashamed, but because crying in public was a luxury, a habit she had spent a lifetime unlearning. A woman sitting nearby, an older woman with kind, tired eyes, watched her for a moment, then leaned over and offered a clean, folded tissue without a word. Lena managed a small, grateful smile and looked up through the grimy glass ceiling at the starless, unforgiving night sky. It was funny, in a cruel, cosmic way. She had survived so much worse than a slap. She had endured being abandoned by a foster family at age 11. She had survived the slow, heartbreaking death of her own infant son, from an illness no doctor could name. She had been told, over and over, that she was too soft, too quiet, too sensitive to handle the hard, sharp edges of the world. But that house, those two small, broken boys, they had reached something inside of her, a deep, dormant well of hope she hadn't touched in years. The train to Savannah, the one that would take her back to the only family she had left, pulled into the station with a long, mournful sigh of brakes and metal. She stood up slowly, her body aching, her ticket a crumpled promise in her coat pocket. Destination: escape. but her heart. Her heart was still upstairs in a grand white house in Greenwich, Connecticut, where two little boys were finally, blessedly, learning how to sleep through the night. She sat back down on the hard, cold bench. The train pulled away without her. The next morning, Edward stood in his son's room holding a silver tray laden with their breakfast: scrambled eggs, toast cut into triangles with the crusts removed, a small bowl of fresh sliced strawberries. He hadn't done this before. Not once since their mother died. Eli sat up in bed, his small face groggy with sleep. "Where's Miss Lena?" he asked, his voice small and fragile. Edward hesitated, the simple question a fresh stab of guilt. Ethan sat up, too, his gaze sharp and instantly wary. "Is she gone?" Edward nodded, the movement feeling heavy, difficult. She had to leave." "Why?" Eli's voice cracked on the single word. "She didn't do anything bad," Ethan said, his own voice low and accusatory, his eyes narrowing. "She helped us. You saw. We were good." Edward knelt beside the bed, placing the tray carefully on the nightstand, his hands unsteady. "It wasn't your fault," he said, his voice thick with a shame he couldn't hide. "It was mine." Eli looked at him, his gaze direct and unflinching. "Did you yell at her?" Edward didn't lie. He couldn't. "Yes." "Did you hit her?" Ethan's voice was a low, dangerous whisper. Edward's throat tightened, the confession a physical weight. He nodded once, a small, jerky movement. Both boys turned away from him, a silent, unified, and utterly devastating judgment. He stayed there, kneeling on the soft, expensive carpet for a long, painful time, the silence in the room a suffocating presence. "I'll fix it," he said finally, his voice a raw whisper. "I swear, I'll bring her back." They didn't respond, but he knew they had heard him. Later that day, Lena, having spent the night on the hard benches of the train station, boarded not a long-distance train, but a local city bus. She rode it to a nearby underfunded community shelter where she used to volunteer on her days off, a place of organized, compassionate chaos. She needed space. She needed perspective. She needed to be somewhere she could remember that the world was bigger than one grand broken house, even if that house had, for a brief, beautiful moment, held her heart. She taught a writing class that afternoon to a small group of teenage girls, many of them runaways, their eyes old and wary. She didn't tell them stories about Edward or his children. She told them stories about the quiet, radical act of choosing to stay when everyone else walks away, about the profound importance of knowing your own worth, especially when the world around you refuses to see it. When she left the shelter that evening, there was a small, folded note stuck in the spokes of her bicycle. It wasn't from Edward. It was from Mrs. Keller. It said, simply, "They asked for you. Both of them. All day." Lena looked up at the sky, which was now streaked with the vibrant, hopeful colors of orange and pink. And this time, when she smiled, it was not a gesture of polite defense. It was real. Edward Hawthorne did not knock. He simply stepped into the cavernous, echoing gymnasium of the old community center just as the sun was beginning its final, glorious descent behind the skeletal winter trees, casting long, golden, apologetic shadows across the worn linoleum floor. The sharp, authoritative sound of his polished, expensive leather shoes on the scuffed floor was jarringly out of place here, a discordant note in the humble symphony of the room, a cello in a punk rock band. But he didn't flinch. He scanned the large, chilly space, his gaze sweeping past a group of teenagers playing a half-hearted game of basketball, until he spotted her at the far end of the gym. Lena. She was crouched beside a large, rolling whiteboard, her back to him, methodically erasing the crooked, hopeful letters from an afternoon lesson. A loose circle of teenage girls surrounded her, their notebooks sprawled on the floor, their laughter and easy chatter a testament to the safe, gentle space she had clearly created for them. She laughed with them, a soft, genuine sound, and her voice, lighter and less burdened than he remembered it, seemed to fill the vast empty space with a warmth that had nothing to do with the failing heating system. He didn't realize he had been holding his breath, a tight, anxious knot in his chest, until she looked up. Her sixth sense for a shifting atmosphere alerted, and saw him standing there. The laughter died, not because anyone told it to, but because something in Lena's posture shifted. A subtle, almost imperceptible straightening of her spine. A curtain of professional composure drawn mid-performance. She stood up slowly, her expression unreadable. He walked forward, his hands empty. He had brought no briefcase, no pre-written apology letter drafted by his legal team. Just the heavy, invisible weight of what he had done. "I need to talk to you," he said, his voice quieter than he'd intended. The girls looked at him, their expressions instantly wary, a silent, protective phalanx forming around Lena. One of them, a girl with defiant blue hair and a lip ring, even took a small, subtle step in front of her. "It's okay, Chloe," Lena said gently, placing a reassuring hand on the girl's shoulder, and the tense, young warrior relaxed. Edward's gaze flickered to the whiteboard. A single, powerful sentence had been written across the top, the only part she hadn't yet erased. "Your voice has value, even when it shakes." The words felt like another indictment. He turned back to Lena. "May I?" She nodded, a small, formal inclination of her head, and led him outside to a solitary, weather-beaten wooden bench by the bus stop. It was the same bench, he realized with a fresh pang of guilt, that she had likely sat on the day before, her hands wrapped around a cold cup of coffee, her tears hidden in the lonely corners of her eyes. "I was wrong," he said, the words coming out before he had even fully sat down. A raw, unadorned confession. "I judged you. I reacted without thinking, without listening, and I put my hands on you. That is something I will have to live with, something I will regret for the rest of my life." Lena said nothing. She just sat there, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze fixed on the darkening horizon. "I saw you in my space, in my bed, with my sons," he continued, the words difficult, painful. "And I let my own fear and my own selfish grief speak louder than the truth. That wasn't just unfair to you. It was cruel." "You didn't believe me," she said finally, her voice not angry, just flat, weary. "You didn't believe me, even after your own sons had learned to trust me." "I know," he said, his own voice a low, ashamed whisper. She looked away, toward the street, where the headlights of passing cars cut fleeting, lonely paths through the twilight. "You don't get to walk back into my life and expect a parade just because you finally realized I was telling the truth all along." "I'm not here to clear my name," he said quickly. "I'm not here for a parade. I'm here because they asked for you, not a nanny, not a replacement. You." Lena's eyes, when they finally turned back to him, had softened, just slightly. "How are they?" she asked, the question filled with a genuine, aching concern that twisted the knife of his guilt even deeper. "Quiet," he admitted. "Too quiet." She nodded slowly, her expression knowing. "That's not peace, Mr. Hawthorne. That's a wound closing over without healing properly." He looked down at his own hands, which were clasped tightly between his knees. "I want to fix this." "You can't fix it," she said, the words sharp but not unkind. "But you can start by acknowledging that what your sons need from you isn't control. its connection. He exhaled, a long, ragged breath. "Come back, Lena." She didn't answer right away. Instead, she asked a question that cut to the very heart of the matter. "If I say yes, will I still be staff?" He hesitated for a fraction of a second, but it was enough. "No," he said, his voice firm, certain. You'll have whatever title you want. Advisor, mentor, partner." He saw her eyebrow arch slightly at the last word. "Partner in their care," he clarified quickly, though the word lingered in the cold air, heavier and more significant than he had intended. She considered his offer, her gaze thoughtful, analytical. "Fine," she said finally, "but I have conditions." "Of course," he said, relieved. "First, no more cameras in the children's rooms, or anywhere else they are meant to feel safe." He blinked. "There are none." "There were," she said, her voice flat. "The nanny before me told me. She quit because of them." He frowned, a memory stirring. "They were meant for safety." "They teach children that their privacy isn't theirs to keep," she countered. He nodded once, agreed. "Second," she continued, "they eat dinner at the table, with you, every night. No phones, no business calls." He hesitated again, the demands of his empire warring with the needs of his sons. But then he nodded again. "Agreed." "Third," she said, her voice gaining strength, "we rewrite the house rules. Together. With them." He stared at her. "They're 5 years old." "They're people," she replied simply. He felt the corner of his mouth twitch, the first ghost of a smile in days. "Anything else?" She took a deep, steadying breath. "Yes. The next time you raise your hand to someone who doesn't deserve it, to me, to anyone, I'm gone. And this time, I won't come back." His fleeting smile vanished. The weight of his transgression settled over him again, heavy and permanent. "Understood." She stood up. "I'll see them in the morning." He stood, too. Do you want to ride back?" She shook her head. "I'll take the bus. I still have to finish my class here." He nodded, feeling a fresh wave of admiration for her quiet, unshakable sense of duty. "Lena, thank you." She paused at the door to the community center. "Don't thank me yet," she said, her voice cool but not unkind. "We're starting over, Mr. Hawthorne, and this time I won't be walking on eggshells." She turned and walked back into the brightly lit building, the whiteboard and its hopeful, shaking voice waiting for her return. Edward stood at the curb for a long time, watching her go, the cold night air a bracing shock to his system. That night, for the first time in a year, he cleared the dinner table himself. He called his sons downstairs. He sat between them with a bowl of spaghetti and awkwardly, clumsily, tried to tell them a bedtime story, getting the names of the characters wrong, his voices too stiff and formal. They laughed at him, not unkindly, just honestly. And later, upstairs in their freshly made beds, in the dark, Ethan whispered to Eli, "She's coming back." "How do you know?" Eli asked, his voice a small, hopeful sound in the darkness. "Because she said goodbye to us," Ethan replied, his 5-year-old logic simple and profound as he pulled the blanket over his head. "Nobody else ever does that." The next morning, Lena returned to the Hawthorne estate. The sky was a soft, bruised wash of peach and slate blue. Birds, stark black silhouettes against the nascent light, flitted along the bare branches of the ancient oak trees, and the vast manicured lawn glistened with a delicate lacework of frost. She stood at the imposing wrought-iron gates for a long moment before they swung open, silent and automated, gripping the worn leather straps of her canvas bag like a shield. Everything in the landscape looked exactly the same. The sweeping circular drive, the perfectly trimmed hedges, the cold, majestic facade of the great house. But nothing felt the same. She felt different. The butler, Harold, a man whose quiet professionalism usually bordered on invisibility, greeted her at the massive front door with a stunned blink of his pale blue eyes, then stepped aside with a slight, almost imperceptible bow. "Miss Williams," he said, his voice imbued with something close to reverence. "Welcome back." "Thank you, Harold," Lena replied, her own voice steady as she walked past the polished marble foyer, the towering crystal chandelier that glittered like a frozen waterfall, and the oppressive silence that had once felt so stifling and now just felt sad. She could hear them before she saw them, the sound of small, quick, and utterly uncoordinated footsteps on the upstairs landing. Then a triumphant, joyful shout. "She's here!" Eli rounded the curve of the grand staircase first, his small body a blur of motion, his arms flung wide, a grin of pure, unadulterated delight stretching from ear to ear. Ethan followed a half-step behind, his movements slower, more considered, but his eyes were bright with a light she hadn't seen in them before. He was clutching a familiar worn sketchbook to his chest. Lena knelt down on the cold marble floor just in time to catch Eli as he launched himself into her arms. "Well, hello to you too," she said, laughing softly into the sweet-smelling chaos of his curls, her own heart swelling with an emotion so fierce it almost hurt. "We made you a welcome-back sign," Ethan mumbled, his shyness still a fragile barrier, as he thrust the sketchbook at her. On the first page was a wobbly, heartfelt drawing of her, the two boys, and a very tall, very imposing house. But this time, a big, red, lopsided heart was drawn over the front door. The caption beneath, in Ethan's careful developing print, read, "You stayed, even when you left." Lena's throat tightened. "That's beautiful, honey," she managed to say, her voice thick. "Thank you." Soft, measured footsteps approached from behind them. Edward stood at the base of the stairs, dressed not in his usual starched, armored suit, but in a soft gray sweater and dark jeans. He looked less like a corporate titan and more like a man trying, with great, uncertain effort, to be a father. He looked like someone trying, not someone pretending. "Breakfast is ready," he said, his voice quiet. Lena stood up, smoothing the front of her simple blouse. "Good," she said, a small determined smile touching her lips. "Because after breakfast, we have some rules to rewrite." In the kitchen, the four of them gathered around the large, circular breakfast table. There were no hovering staff, no phones buzzing on the counter, just a large bowl of scrambled eggs, a platter of toast with honey, and a pitcher of fresh orange juice. It felt, for the first time, like a family. "So," Lena began, pulling out a clean notebook and a pen from her bag, "we're going to talk about what it means to live in this house together. What's fair? What's safe? And what, for each of us, makes a house feel like a home?" Ethan raised his hand immediately, as if in school. "Can we have music during bath time? Loud music?" Lena nodded, writing it down. "Reasonable." Eli, his mouth full of toast, added, "And no broccoli, unless it's disguised as a tree and mashed potatoes." Edward coughed, a sound that was half a laugh. "I may need some legal clarification on that particular clause." Lena smiled. "We'll keep a list. But this isn't just about vegetables and music. It's about boundaries." She looked directly at Edward, her gaze steady and unwavering. "For all of us." He met her gaze and nodded, his own expression serious now. "Understood." Over the next hour, a new constitution was drafted. The boys, armed with crayons, scribbled their own rules on a large sheet of paper. "Always knock before coming in." No yelling near bedtime. Hugs must be asked for first. Pancakes on Sundays. And one story each, no matter how tired Daddy is, before lights out. Lena wrote down her own rules in the notebook. Listen first, react second. Apologize when you're wrong. No cameras, no exceptions. Edward, after a moment of quiet contemplation, added a single elegant line in his neat, decisive handwriting. Make space for forgiveness, even when it's hard. When they were done, Lena took the boys' crayon-covered manifesto and taped it to the gleaming stainless steel refrigerator with two smiling magnets shaped like suns. "There," she said, stepping back, "the new rules of the Hawthorne house." Later, while the boys were outside chasing squirrels across the frost-covered lawn, Edward found Lena in the library, a room she had only ever dusted before. She was sorting through shelves of children's books, separating the ones that were age-appropriate from the ones that were not. "They've changed since you were gone," he said, his voice a low murmur from the doorway. She glanced up, a small, knowing smile on her lips. "Or maybe," she countered gently, "they were always capable of this joy, and no one ever gave them the space to show it." "I've changed too," he said, his voice more hesitant now, a quiet admission of his own transformation. She didn't look away this time. "I believe that." He stepped closer into the room, his hands shoved into the pockets of his jeans. "What you did, staying, leaving, and then coming back, that's more grace than I deserved." Lena stood up, placing the last book, a worn copy of The Velveteen Rabbit. "See it on the shelf." "Maybe," she said, "but it's exactly what they deserved. And I wasn't going to let your mistake become their permanent lesson." He flinched a little at the directness of her words, but he nodded, accepting the truth in them. "I want to be better," he said, his voice raw with a sincerity that was both new and profound. "Then start by being present," she replied. "Really present. Not just when it's easy. Not just when they're smiling." He looked down, a shadow of his past shame flickering across his face. Do you think they'll ever truly forgive me?" Lena's expression softened. "They already have," she said. "Kids are better at that than adults. But you have to earn that forgiveness every single day from now on." That evening, for the first time since Rebecca's death, Edward tucked the boys into bed himself. He read to them from a storybook, his voice clumsy, and his character interpretations hilariously bad. Lena stood by the door, listening as the boys giggled at his mispronunciations, corrected him on the plot points, and then, in unison, asked for just one more page. After the lights were out, and the house had settled into a new, more peaceful quiet, Edward walked Lena to the front hallway. "I was thinking," he said, his tone casual but his eyes serious, "about what you said, about not being staff, about being more." She crossed her arms gently, waiting. "You're not going to offer me a promotion, are you?" she asked, a hint of teasing in her voice. He smiled faintly. "No, I was going to offer you a voice." She tilted her head, intrigued. "I want you to help me build something," he said. "Not just for them, for other kids like them, kids who've lost something or someone." Lena's eyes widened, the full import of his words sinking in. "You mean a foundation?" He nodded. "Something real, something meaningful. You guide it. I'll fund it." She stared at him for a long, silent moment. Then slowly, a brilliant, genuine smile spread across her face. "If we do this," she said, "it's on our terms. No media circus. No performative charity. Just real work." "Agreed," he said, extending his hand. She took it. "Then we have a deal, Mr. Hawthorne." He shook her hand, his grip warm and firm. "Call me Edward." She smiled. "All right, Edward." That night, as she walked to the guest room, her own space now, no longer just a temporary bed in a house that wasn't hers, she paused outside the boys' room. From within, she could hear a soft whisper. "She came back," Eli said. "I told you," Ethan replied, his voice sleepy but triumphant. And Lena, leaning her head gently against the cool, smooth wood of the door frame, whispered back to herself, "I did." 3 weeks after Lena's return, the Hawthorne estate no longer echoed with the heavy, oppressive silence of grief, but hummed with the vibrant, chaotic, and beautiful music of life. Breakfasts were louder, filled with debates about whether superheroes could get cavities. Bath times were messier, with entire naval fleets of rubber ducks being launched and subsequently sunk. And the boys, Ethan and Eli, once so withdrawn and brittle they seemed in danger of shattering, had begun to bloom like wildflowers finally freed from a long, hard winter. The new rules of the house, taped to the refrigerator, were now slightly worn at the edges from eager, sometimes sticky, fingers pointing at them daily. And Edward, who had once been the stoic, emotionally distant patriarch, found himself on the floor, folding tiny socks, and learning, with much trial and error, how to braid the hair on one of Isabel's old dolls. But not everything changed at the same pace. The ghosts of the past were not so easily banished. Late one Friday night, well after the boys had fallen asleep and the rest of the staff had gone to bed, Lena found herself wandering the darkened halls. She often did this when the weight of her own memories pressed too hard against her chest, when the quiet of her own room felt too loud. The silent, moonlit corridors of the great house helped her think, helped her breathe. But this night, something was off. The library door, which was always kept firmly shut, was slightly ajar. A thin, sharp line of light spilled through the crack. She pushed it open gently, her heart giving a small, anxious flutter. Edward was there, seated at the massive presidential desk, his shoulders slumped forward, his phone in one hand and a half-empty glass of scotch in the other. He didn't notice her at first. He was staring at the phone's screen, his face illuminated by its cold blue light, his expression a mask of raw, unguarded pain. "Bad news?" she asked softly from the doorway. He flinched slightly, startled, then glanced up, his eyes taking a moment to focus. "Lena, sorry, I didn't hear you come in." "You're 3 fingers into a bottle of bourbon," she said, stepping into the room, her voice gentle but observant. "I figured something was wrong." He set the glass down with a heavy thud, the sound echoing in the quiet room. He cleared his throat. Just reading an email." She waited, her silence an invitation, not a demand. He knew she wouldn't press, and that was precisely why he found himself wanting to tell her. Finally, with a sigh of resignation, he turned the screen of his phone so she could see. The subject line of the email was stark and brutal. "Custody hearing. Notice of motion." Lena blinked, her own heart sinking. "A custody hearing? For the boys?" He nodded, his jaw tight. "Rebecca's parents, the Hollingsworths. They've filed a petition for temporary guardianship, claiming I'm an unfit parent." "On what grounds?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He let out a bitter, humorless scoff. "The usual. Neglect, emotional instability, and, of course," he tapped the screen, highlighting a particular phrase, "a recent, documented domestic incident involving household staff." Lena's face darkened. "They found out about what happened. About me." "Apparently," he muttered, his voice thick with a self-loathing that was palpable. They've been watching, waiting for me to make a mistake, and I handed them one on a silver platter. Now that the boys are finally starting to open up, now that we've finally found some small measure of stability, they want to rip it all away. She sat down in the leather chair across from him, the space between them suddenly charged with a new, shared crisis. "Have they ever been involved in the boys' lives before now?" she asked. "Not in any meaningful way since the funeral," he said, his voice laced with bitterness. "They blamed me for Rebecca's depression. They said I pushed her too hard, that I buried her in my work, that I kept the boys from grieving properly." He looked up at her, his eyes haunted. "And the worst part is, maybe they weren't entirely wrong." Lena was quiet for a long, contemplative moment. "Do you want me to testify?" she asked finally. "About the changes I've seen in the boys? About the progress they've made? I have it all documented." Edward hesitated, his gaze dropping to the polished surface of the desk. "I don't know if that helps our case or makes things infinitely worse. They'll argue that your very presence here proves I can't parent them alone." "Then maybe we don't fight them alone," she said, her voice gaining a new, firm resolve. "Maybe we don't fight them on their terms at all. Maybe we show them what a real, healing family actually looks like, not what they think it should look like." His eyes, filled with a weary, desperate hope, met hers. "You would do that? Stand up in court for us, after everything I did?" "I would do it for them," Lena said, her voice clear and unwavering. "Not for you, not for appearances, for Ethan and Eli." He exhaled, a long, ragged breath, the tension in his powerful frame releasing, just slightly. "You really believe I can win this?" She stood up, walked to the grand library window, and looked out into the inky, starless dark, toward the wing where the boys' nightlight still glowed, a small, warm beacon in the vastness of the night. "You won't win if you go in there as the man who slapped his nanny," she said softly. "But you will win if you go in as the man who apologized for it, the man who changed, the man who, every single day, chooses to show up." He nodded slowly, the truth of her words settling over him. "Then I'll show up." The next morning, the house buzzed with a quiet, focused urgency. Lena spent the morning reviewing her detailed journal entries, compiling a comprehensive report that documented the twins' daily routines, their emotional progress, their specific therapeutic breakthroughs, and their increasingly positive interactions with their father. She gathered their recent art projects, took photographs of the now cherished rules of the house on the refrigerator, and carefully printed a photo Ethan had drawn just the day before. A picture of the four of them, Edward, Lena, Ethan, and Eli, standing beneath a brilliant, colorful rainbow, all holding hands. No one had told him to draw it. He had simply drawn what, in his young, healing heart, felt true. Meanwhile, Edward called his lawyer and scheduled an emergency strategy meeting. For the first time, his instructions were not about reputation management or asset protection. They were about protecting two little boys who had already lost far too much. At lunch, Lena sat with the twins under the great oak tree in the backyard, cutting their grilled cheese sandwiches into triangles and listening as they argued with the grave seriousness of 5-year-olds about which superhero would win in a foot race, the Flash or Sonic the Hedgehog. "Do we have to go and live with Grandma and Grandpa Hollingsworth?" Eli asked suddenly, his little voice barely above a whisper, the question a stark, painful intrusion into their peaceful afternoon. Lena stilled, her hand pausing mid-cut. "Why would you ask that, honey?" "I heard Daddy on the phone," Ethan said, his own voice tight, his eyes fixed on his sandwich. "He was yelling. They don't like him." Lena set her plate aside, her full attention now on the two small, worried faces before her. "Boys, listen to me. No one is taking you anywhere without a fight. And I promise you, I'm not going anywhere either." "But they're rich," Ethan said, as if that settled the matter. "And they're, you know, white." Lena blinked, surprised by the blunt, painful observation. "What does that have to do with anything?" Ethan shrugged, a small, helpless gesture. "They said on the phone that Daddy's made bad choices, and that you're not part of the family." Lena leaned in close, her voice soft but fierce, cupping Eli's small chin gently in her hand. "Let me tell you something, and I want you to listen very carefully. Families aren't built from having the same skin color or the same last names. They are built from who stays. They are built from who fights for you when things get hard. And I am here. That makes me family." Eli, his eyes wide and shining with unshed tears, wrapped his small arms around her neck. A silent, desperate hug. "Then you better win," he mumbled into her shoulder. Lena looked up at the house, where Edward stood behind the library window, watching them. He couldn't hear their words, but he could see the embrace. He gave a faint, almost imperceptible nod. They were ready to fight. That night, Lena sat at the small desk in her guest room, the warm glow of the lamp illuminating the pages she was typing. It was her official statement for the court. It wasn't grand or filled with legal jargon. It was simple. It was honest. It was true. She described the boy's profound anxieties when she first arrived, the screaming fits that seemed to come from nowhere, the hollow, unnerving silences, the way they would reach for her hand and then snatch it back, as if terrified of the very idea of hope. And then she described how, over time, with patience and consistency and a love that asked for nothing in return, they had started laughing again, sleeping through the night again, trusting again. At the bottom of the last page, she wrote, "Healing doesn't happen in clean, straight lines. It is messy and unpredictable and often painful. But in the Hawthorne house, over the last few months, I have had the profound privilege of witnessing two little boys begin to stitch themselves and their father back together. Not because of money, not because of blood, but because someone finally chose to stay." She printed it, placed it in a clean manila folder, and left it on Edward's desk in the library. As she turned to leave, her gaze fell upon the small, faded note he had once kept, her own handwriting, still taped to the edge of a silver photo frame. "If you can't stay for them, at least don't push away the ones who will." She smiled, a small, sad, but hopeful smile. Because now, finally, no one was pushing away, and everyone was staying. The courthouse, a grand, imposing edifice of polished marble and cold, intimidating columns, smelled of floor wax and old, unresolved nerves. The morning sun, a pale, watery winter light, poured through the tall, arched windows in long, golden, accusatory shafts. Lena sat beside Edward in the hushed, tense waiting area, both of them dressed in muted, conservative tones. Him in a tailored charcoal gray suit that seemed to hang on his frame with a new, weary weight. Her in a soft navy blue dress with long sleeves, just long enough to cover the faint, silvery scar still healing on her wrist from a night, weeks ago, when both twins had woken up with nightmares, and she had held them, one in each arm, until dawn. Edward glanced sideways at her, his own anxiety a palpable presence. "Nervous?" She kept her gaze fixed on the ornate double doors of the courtroom. "Only about the things I can't control," she said, her voice a low, steady murmur. Across the wide, echoing room sat the Hollingsworths, James and Eleanor, draped in their affluence like a suit of impenetrable armor. Eleanor wore pearls, a neatly pressed cream-colored skirt suit, and the kind of severe, disapproving stare that could curdle milk from 50 paces. James, a man who had built a small empire on ruthless real estate deals, looked less composed, his hand twitching restlessly against the silver head of his cane, his eyes darting toward Edward with a barely concealed venomous contempt. They had not acknowledged Lena's presence, not even with a flicker of their eyes. In their world, she was not a person. She was an exhibit, Exhibit A, in the case against their son-in-law. The door to courtroom 5 swung open, and a bailiff, his voice a bored, monotonous drone, called them in. Lena stood up, straightened her shoulders, and whispered to herself, a silent prayer to a God she wasn't sure she still believed in. This is for Ethan and Eli. Inside, the courtroom was even colder than the hallway. A judge, a formidable older woman with silver hair, swept into a tight, unforgiving bun, and a pair of reading glasses hanging from a delicate silver chain around her neck, sat perched behind a tall, imposing bench, like an eagle on its eyrie. Her nameplate, in stark black letters, read, Honorable Judith M. Templeton. Edward's lawyer, a calm, experienced man named Mr. Fields, stood first. His voice was a practiced, soothing baritone, with just enough humanity in his tone to not sound rehearsed. He spoke of the sudden, tragic loss of Rebecca Hawthorne, of the family's profound struggle to rebuild in the wake of such a devastating tragedy, and of Edward's recent, exhaustive efforts to stabilize the home environment for his 2 young sons. He highlighted the consistent, twice-weekly therapy sessions for the children, their documented progress reports from school, and, most notably, the stabilizing, essential presence of one Lena Williams. Then, Eleanor Hollingsworth took the stand. Her voice, though polished and refined by years of society luncheons, trembled with a carefully cultivated indignation. We only want what is best for our grandchildren, Your Honor. What kind of an example is a man who hires an unqualified stranger to raise his children? A man who, by his own admission in a deposition, struck this very woman in his own home? Lena didn't flinch, though her cheek burned with the phantom heat of the memory. And she isn't even family, Eleanor added, her voice tightening with a final dismissive flourish. Judge Templeton raised a single, skeptical eyebrow. Miss Williams is not on trial here, Mrs. Hollingsworth. But her presence is such the issue, Your Honor, Eleanor insisted, her voice rising slightly. Edward is clearly incapable of caring for the boys on his own. He is outsourcing their most basic emotional needs to someone else, someone temporary, unrelated, and improperly trained. She has no advanced degrees in child psychology, no state-issued license. The judge turned her cool, intelligent gaze toward Lena. Miss Williams, do you wish to respond to that? Lena stood up and approached the bench, her movements calm and deliberate. She didn't carry any notes. She didn't need them. She carried the truth in her heart. I do not have a degree in child psychology, Your Honor, she said, her voice quiet but clear, carrying to every corner of the silent room. But I have lived through more pain than I would wish on any person in this world. And I know what it looks like when children stop believing that they are safe. She paused, letting her voice steady, drawing strength from an invisible source. When I first arrived at the Hawthorne estate, Ethan and Eli didn't speak to anyone but each other, and even then, only in whispers. They didn't sleep through the night. They didn't trust anyone. Not their father, not the staff, not even themselves. But little by little, day by day, they let me in. And it wasn't because I'm special, or because I have some magic touch. It was because I stayed. It was because I didn't run when it got hard. It was because I looked them in the eye and said, with my words and my actions, "You matter. Your pain matters. And you are not alone." She met Eleanor's cold gaze, then James's. "You say I am unqualified. But what qualifies someone to love children who are not their own? What degree do you get for choosing them every single day without obligation? Because that is what I have done. Not for a paycheck, not for praise, but because someone, Your Honor, someone needed to." Judge Templeton sat back in her high-backed chair, her expression unreadable. "Thank you, Miss Williams." Lena returned to her seat. Underneath the table, out of sight, Edward reached over and gently, gratefully, squeezed her hand. Later, after all the testimony had been heard, Judge Templeton addressed the silent, expectant courtroom. This court does not take custody challenges lightly, especially when they are initiated by extended family against a surviving parent who is, by all accounts, actively engaged in his children's care. She looked down at the documents before her. After reviewing all the evidence and the testimony provided today, it is clear to this court that while Mr. Edward Hawthorne has certainly made mistakes, he has also taken meaningful, consistent, and profound steps toward healing his family. The boys are, by all metrics, thriving under his care, in large part due to the extraordinary support and dedication of Miss Williams. She glanced, just for a moment, toward the Hollingsworths. This court sees no legitimate grounds to remove custody from Mr. Hawthorne. Petition denied. A sharp, strangled gasp escaped Eleanor's lips, followed by a rustle as she started to rise in protest. But James placed a firm, restraining hand on her wrist. "Let it go, Eleanor," he whispered, his voice a low, defeated rasp. Lena sat perfectly still, her heart thundering against her ribs, but her face remained composed. Outside, in the cool, crisp autumn air, Edward turned to her, his own face a mixture of relief and disbelief. "You saved them," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Again." She shook her head, a small, genuine smile finally touching her lips. "No. You did. You stood up. You told the truth. You stayed in the room." The boys were waiting for them at home, unaware of the verdict, curled up on the living room sofa with Harold, the butler, who was reading them a comic book aloud in his deep, resonant baritone. When Edward and Lena walked through the door, Eli, who had been watching the doorway all afternoon, was the first to spot them. "Did we win?" he asked, his voice a small, hopeful whisper. Lena knelt down, her eyes shining. "We did, sweetheart. We did." Ethan, in a rare display of uninhibited affection, launched himself into her arms, wrapping his own small arms around her waist. "Does that mean you're not leaving? Ever?" Lena kissed the top of his head, her own tears finally falling. "I am exactly where I belong." Later that night, as they tucked the boys into their beds, Edward stood in the doorway, watching as Lena hummed them to sleep, the same soft, simple melody she always did. When she stepped into the hallway, he said quietly, his voice filled with a humility she had never heard in it before, "I have never been very good at saying thank you." "Then don't," she replied softly. "Just keep showing up." He nodded, his eyes softer and clearer than she had ever seen them. "Tomorrow," he said, "we begin the work of building that foundation. I already have the architects scheduled to come by." She smiled. "And the name?" she asked. He paused, a slow, thoughtful smile spreading across his own face. "The Hawthorne Williams Center for Healing and Hope." Lena blinked, caught completely off guard, her heart swelling. That's a lot." "It's the truth," he said simply. "You didn't just save them, Lena. You helped me build this. With us." She looked past him, into the darkened room where the two boys now slept, soundly and without fear. And she thought that maybe, just maybe, this wasn't the end of a long, painful fight. It was the beginning of everything. The first board meeting of the Hawthorne Williams Center for Healing and Hope was held not in a sterile, glass-walled high-rise or a formal, intimidating ballroom, but in the sun-drenched, airy sunroom of the Hawthorne estate. The furniture was a comfortable, mismatched collection of armchairs and sofas. The coffee, brewed by Edward himself, was slightly burnt, and one of the twins had left a colorful crayon drawing taped to the window, a lopsided tree with the words scrawled in a child's unsteady hand, written above it. Home. Lena sat at the head of the informal circle, her fingers laced around a warm ceramic mug, her expression steady but alert. Edward sat to her left, dressed in jeans and a simple button-up shirt, his sleeves rolled to his elbows. He did not, for once, try to dominate the room. He simply listened, taking meticulous notes in a leather-bound pad, occasionally tapping a pencil against his chin in thought. Across from them sat the three prospective partners they had invited. Dr. Angela Monroe, a retired, highly respected child therapist with a warm, empathetic face and eyes that radiated a deep, quiet intelligence. Joseph Kim, a passionate, energetic outreach coordinator from a local foster care program, and Lionel Pierce, a sharp, cynical tech investor and one of Edward's oldest, if not most skeptical, friends. "So let me get this straight," Lionel said, pushing up his expensive wire-framed glasses and looking around the room with an air of amused disbelief. "You want to build a space for children who have experienced profound trauma, but it's not a clinic, it's not a shelter, it's not a school, and it's not focused on adoption." "That's correct," Lena replied, her voice calm and even. "It's a third place, a sanctuary, a bridge between where these children are and where they want to be." Dr. Monroe leaned forward, intrigued, her professional curiosity piqued. "And who would staff such a place?" "People like me," Lena said simply. "Not just credentialed experts, though we will have them too, but survivors, mentors, adults who have lived through the fire themselves and can teach others not how to avoid the flames, but how to walk through them and emerge whole." Joseph Kim, the outreach coordinator, scribbled something in his notebook. "And how do you plan to handle the practicalities? The funding, the oversight, the immense liability?" Edward cut in then, his voice gentle but firm. "We will handle the logistics, the endowment, the legal structure, the insurance. Lena will lead the heart." Lionel blinked, looking from Edward's earnest face to Lena's quiet composure. "And the name," he said, a note of incredulity in his voice. "The Hawthorne Williams Center. That stays?" Lena smiled, a small, confident smile that transformed her face. "Yes, Lionel," she said, "it stays." By the end of the hour-long meeting, the impossible had begun to seem possible. Dr. Monroe had enthusiastically agreed to join as the center's clinical advisor. Joseph Kim had offered his extensive network of connections with local social service agencies. And Lionel Pierce, after a long, dramatic sigh and one muttered, "This is either the most brilliant or the most doomed philanthropic venture I have ever seen," agreed to personally fund the first 6 months of programming. When the others had left, Lena stayed behind to clean up the coffee mugs and papers. Edward stood in the doorway, watching her, a look of profound admiration on his face. "You handled that like a seasoned C-suite executive," he said. She looked up and smirked. I taught a creative writing class to a group of 16-year-old runaway girls for 3 years, she replied. Boardrooms don't scare me. He stepped fully into the room, his hands in his pockets. You were amazing. She didn't answer right away. She was staring at the crayon drawing on the window, at the lopsided tree and the single, powerful word. Home. You know, she said softly, her voice almost a whisper. When I was growing up, after my parents died, I was moved 12 times. 12 different foster homes in 9 years. I never once felt like any of them were mine. Edward followed her gaze to the drawing. That's why this matters so much to you. She nodded, her throat tight with emotion. Every child deserves to have roots, and they deserve to have wings. Later that day, the twins helped Lena unpack boxes of art supplies, paint, clay, colored pencils, for the center's temporary setup in the east wing of the house. Ethan carefully, meticulously, stacked jars of tempera paint by color, while Eli sorted a mountain of paintbrushes by size. Do we get to come here too? Eli asked, his eyes wide with a mixture of excitement and concern. This is your home, Lena said, her voice soft. So, yes, you not only get to come here, you get to help make it better for other kids who aren't as lucky as you are. Ethan looked up from his paints. Can we teach them our house rules? He asked. Lena knelt beside him, her heart swelling. I think that's a great idea, sweetie. They spent the rest of the afternoon creating a new, more elaborate version of the rules of the house, this time illustrated in bright, glorious color, with Ethan drawing dozens of smiling suns and Eli adding entire families of stick figures. Meanwhile, in the main house, Edward made a difficult and legally complicated phone call. He had spoken to his lawyer that morning. There was, his lawyer had confirmed, no legal requirement to include Lena in any official parental decision-making for the twins. She had no formal custody, no paperwork, no legal standing whatsoever. But as he had looked through the window at the way she knelt beside his children, her head bent close to theirs as they worked on their drawing, he realized that there was a truth deeper and more profound than legality. She was already their family. In every way that mattered, she was already their mother. He picked up the phone. Mr. Fields, he said, I need you to file a petition with the family court. And I need a message delivered to Judge Templeton. Please tell her it's Edward Hawthorne calling. 2 weeks later, a large, heavy, official-looking envelope arrived in the mail, addressed to Lena. It came with a handwritten note from Edward on his personal stationery. No more temporary, no more blurred lines. You deserve the title you have already earned. Inside the envelope was a formal appointment document, naming her as the co-director of the foundation and, more astonishingly, as the legal guardian of the twins in the event of his absence or death. Attached to it was a notarized petition, ready to be filed, with Edward requesting that the court grant shared legal guardianship of Ethan and Eli Hawthorne to him and one Lena Williams. Lena read it 3 times before her hands began to shake uncontrollably. She hadn't asked for this. She hadn't even allowed herself to imagine it. But somehow, it was exactly what she had always, secretly, wanted, without knowing how to name it. That night, she sat with Edward on the back porch. The boys were asleep upstairs, and a fire crackled gently in the large outdoor stone hearth. You didn't have to do this, she said quietly, the legal documents resting in her lap. I know, he replied, his gaze fixed on the dancing flames. But I needed to. She turned to him, her own eyes shining in the firelight. Why now? Because they deserve permanence, he said. And so do you. She blinked away the sudden hot sting of tears. I'm not perfect, Edward. Neither am I, he said. but they don't need us to be perfect. They just need us to be present. And you, Lena, you have never, not for one single day, left." She reached for his hand, her fingers lacing with his. He didn't flinch this time. He held it, his grip warm and sure. Above them, a soft wind stirred the branches of the great oak tree. And for the first time in a very, very long time, Lena Williams felt a deep and sacred sense of peace settle inside her, a feeling she once thought she would never experience again. It was the feeling of home. Lena didn't expect to see her mother again. She certainly didn't expect her to show up, unannounced, at the formidable front gate of the Hawthorne estate on a crisp Monday afternoon, wearing a weathered denim jacket that had seen better days and carrying a palpable, almost visible aura of years of unsaid things in her eyes. It was Edward who had answered the call from the intercom, his voice a confused murmur through the kitchen speaker. "Lena, there's a woman here. She says she's your mother, a Lorraine Williams." "Beaters?" Lena froze, her hands stilling in the dough she was kneading for that evening's pizza, a weekly tradition she and the boys had started. She was in the middle of sorting educational materials and therapeutic toys for the center's upcoming open house, posters, name tags, laminated behavioral charts, and suddenly her hands felt too heavy to move, the weight of the past rushing in to anchor her to the spot. "She's here?" Lena asked, her voice barely audible. Edward's voice came back, gentle, cautious. "I can send her away if you want." Lena stared at the stack of flashcards she had been organizing on the counter. On top of the pile was a card she had made herself, with a single, simple word written in bold, clear letters. "Forgive." "No," she said, her voice gaining a new, quiet resolve. "It's okay. Let her in." Lorraine Williams stood just inside the grand, marble-floored doorway, like someone waiting to be judged, her hands twisting the worn strap of her handbag, her gaze darting around the magnificent foyer, as if she were unsure what kind of daughter could possibly build, or even inhabit, a life like this. Lena walked down the hallway to meet her, her own expression a complex mixture of old, deep-seated weariness and a new, hard-won steel. "Hey, Mama. I wasn't sure you'd remember me," Lorraine said, her voice gravelly from too many cigarettes and too much time. Lena folded her arms across her chest. "It's not the kind of thing you forget." They sat in the sunroom, the same room where the foundation had been born, Lena on one end of the long, comfortable sofa, Lorraine on the other, with a vast, echoing gulf of years and unspoken pain stretching between them. "I heard your name," Lorraine began, her gaze fixed on a point somewhere over Lena's shoulder. "Some woman at my church, her niece works for a catering company, said you were in the news. Something about this place, this center. Your face was in the paper." Lena didn't answer. She just waited. "I was proud," Lorraine added, her voice dropping to a soft, hesitant whisper. "But I knew you wouldn't want to hear that from me." Lena tilted her head, her gaze finally meeting her mother's. "Why now, Mama? After all these years, why show up now?" Lorraine's eyes, so much like her own, finally filled with tears, and for a moment Lena saw a crack in the tough, brittle mask her mother had worn for as long as she could remember. "Because I'm sick," Lorraine whispered, the words raw, unadorned. "And because I was wrong." That caught Lena completely off guard. "I didn't know how to be a mother to you," Lorraine whispered, the confession a painful, ragged sound. "I was drowning in my own pain, my own failures. Your father, well, he broke more than just the furniture in our house, and when he finally left for good, I didn't know how to hold anything together. Not our lives, not our home, not even you." Lena swallowed hard against the lump that had formed in her throat. "I waited for you," she said, her voice quiet, but not without a tremor of old, childish pain. "For years, I waited for you to come and find me." "I know," Lorraine said, wiping at her face with the back of her hand. "I know, baby. And I failed you. Every single day, I failed you." A long, heavy silence stretched between them, filled with the ghosts of 1,000 unspoken apologies. Then Lena asked a question that surprised even herself. "Do you want to meet the boys?" Lorraine looked up sharply, her tear-filled eyes wide with surprise. You have children?" "Not by blood," Lena said, "but they are mine, in every single way that counts." Lorraine hesitated, her own uncertainty a fragile new thing. Would they like me? Lena looked out the sunroom window, where Ethan and Eli were chasing each other across the lawn with paper airplanes, their joyous, carefree laughter rising like music in the crisp autumn air. "They don't know you," she said, her voice gentle, "but I'll tell them the truth, that you're here and that you're trying." Later that evening, after Lorraine had left, Lena sat at the edge of the boys' beds as they peppered her with a barrage of innocent, direct questions. "She's your real mom?" Ethan asked, his expression one of profound, incredulous wonder. "Why haven't we ever met her before?" Eli chimed in, his own face a mask of confusion. "Because sometimes grown-ups make mistakes," Lena said gently, choosing her words with care. "Big mistakes. And sometimes those mistakes take a very, very long time to fix." "Is she going to come and stay here with us?" Ethan asked, clutching his stuffed tiger, Barnaby, to his chest. "Not right now," Lena said, "but she wants to get to know you, slowly, if you're both okay with that." Eli, always the more thoughtful of the two, looked pensive. "Only if she plays Uno with us," he said finally, his tone one of grave negotiation. Lena laughed, a real, full-throated laugh. "I'll be sure to let her know that's a condition." Downstairs, Edward was waiting for her in the kitchen, a silent, supportive presence. "How'd it go?" he asked as she walked in. "They're curious," Lena said. "More open and forgiving than I ever expected them to be." He poured her a cup of hot chamomile tea. "Are you okay?" he asked, his eyes searching hers. Lena took the warm cup and held it close, its heat a small comfort. "I'm not sure," she admitted honestly, "but I think I want to try. For closure. Maybe even for healing." Edward nodded, his expression one of quiet understanding. "You are braver than most people I know." She looked at him over the rim of her cup. "You make it easier to be." Over the next few days, Lorraine visited the estate in short, measured, and carefully supervised doses. She sat with the twins under the great oak tree, while they, with the solemn authority of 5-year-olds, explained the house rules and showed her the color-coded feelings chart Lena had created. At first, Lorraine seemed stiff, uncertain, terrified of saying or doing the wrong thing. But slowly, in the warm, non-judgmental sun of the children's acceptance, she started to soften. She brought stories from Lena's childhood, the good ones, the ones that Lena herself had almost forgotten. The time she'd tried to build a rocket ship out of cardboard boxes, the lullaby she used to sing to her dolls. She brought homemade cookies that crumbled too much but tasted like long-forgotten Sunday mornings. And she brought photographs, faded and worn at the edges, but filled with moments of a life Lena had missed, or buried. One evening, Lena sat with her mother in the library, flipping through one of the old, dusty albums. "You used to hum that same lullaby you sing to the boys," Lorraine said, her voice a soft, nostalgic murmur. You were 3 years old. You wouldn't sleep without it. Lena blinked, caught off guard by the unexpected memory. I thought I made that tune up. You didn't, Lorraine said. You remembered it, even when you had forgotten me. A comfortable silence fell between them. Then Lorraine reached into her handbag and pulled out a small, tarnished silver box. Inside, on a bed of faded velvet, was a simple, delicate bracelet with a single charm in the shape of a bird. I bought this for you on the day you were born, she said, her voice thick with unshed tears. But I never had the courage to give it to you. Lena picked it up gently, her fingers brushing the tiny, intricate charm. Why a bird? She asked. Because I always knew that one day you would need to fly, Lorraine whispered. I just didn't know how far away you would go. Lena didn't cry. Not then. But later, in the quiet solitude of her own room, with the small, cool weight of the bracelet on her wrist and the moonlight casting soft, forgiving shadows across the floor, she finally let the tears come. Because healing, she was beginning to understand, wasn't a single, dramatic destination. It was 1,000 small, painful, and courageous decisions to open the door again, to try, to forgive not just others, but, most importantly, yourself. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. Fall arrived at the Hawthorne-Williams Center not with a sudden dramatic flourish, but in subtle, gentle whispers. The golden, late-afternoon light lingered a little longer in the mornings. A new, crisp chill kissed your skin just before sunset. Preparations for the center's inaugural Healing Weekend Retreat, a pilot program for a small group of at-risk teens from the local foster care system, were in full swing. Lena stood at the large whiteboard in the newly renovated community room, the heart of the center, mapping out the weekend's schedule with an array of color-coded markers, while the boys, taking their roles as junior co-directors very seriously, folded blankets and arranged pillows on the nearby sofas. Edward passed by, a clipboard in hand and a rare, easy grin on his face. You do realize, don't you, he teased gently, that not a single one of these teenagers is going to follow a color-coded schedule? Lena shot him a playful glare over her shoulder. They won't know it's color-coded, she retorted, but I will. It's what keeps me sane. He laughed, a warm, genuine sound that still felt like a small miracle in the once silent halls of the house. For a moment, everything felt light, easy, possible. But Lena had learned, through hard, painful experience, that with healing always came friction. Growth, true growth, scraped up against the unyielding walls of old, deep wounds. And that friction was coming fast. It started with a phone call from Joseph Kim, their passionate, dedicated liaison with the local foster care agency. Lena, we have a complication, he said, his usually upbeat tone replaced with a note of weary concern. What kind of complication? She asked, her own good mood beginning to evaporate. There's a girl, 16 years old. Her name is Belle. She's been placed in 5 different homes in the past year, and every single one of them has ended badly. She's smart, scary smart, but she's guarded. A fortress. Lena listened quietly, her pen hovering over her notepad. Joseph continued, his voice heavy. She's refusing therapy, won't attend any of her group sessions, and now she's refusing to stay in the system altogether. Her social worker thinks your center might be her last, best shot before she either runs away for good or ends up in juvenile detention. But she's volatile, Lena. I won't lie to you. This isn't a sunshine and rainbows story. Lena took a deep, steadying breath. Bring her in. Belle arrived the next day with a single battered duffel bag, a pair of heavy, scuffed combat boots, and a wall of defiant, impenetrable silence. Her hair was dyed a startling, aggressive shade of cobalt blue, and her arms were folded so tightly across her chest they seemed to be a permanent part of her anatomy, a human shield. She didn't speak a word during the orientation, didn't look anyone in the eye, and made it very clear through her sullen, contemptuous posture that she did not need saving from anyone, especially not from a group of well-meaning strangers in a rich man's house. Eli, who had been cautiously observing her from the doorway, his own small frame a stark contrast to Belle's prickly, defensive energy, whispered to Ethan, "She looks like she could beat up Spider-Man." Lena took a different approach. That evening, while the other teens in the program were playing board games and tentatively swapping school stories in the main common area, Lena found Belle in the corner of the art room, sketching furiously, almost violently, into a worn notebook. "Mind if I sit?" Lena asked softly. Belle just shrugged without looking up. "Free country." Lena sat quietly on a nearby stool. "What are you drawing?" "People," Belle muttered. Lena tilted her head. "Anyone I'd know?" "No one you'd understand." There was no bitterness in her tone, just a vast, empty distance. Lena nodded. "Fair enough." They sat in silence for several long minutes. Lena didn't push, didn't pry, didn't employ any of the therapeutic techniques she had learned. Instead, she pulled a small notepad and a pencil from her own bag and started sketching beside her. Her lines weren't as sharp as Belle's, her shading clumsy and uncertain. But the simple, quiet act of drawing, the act of sitting with Belle as an equal, a fellow creator, spoke louder and more profoundly than any counseling session ever could. Eventually, it was Belle who broke the silence. "Why are you even doing this?" she asked, her voice a low, suspicious murmur. This center, all of it." Lena paused, her pencil stilling on the page. "Because I used to be the kid nobody knew what to do with," she said, her own voice quiet, honest. "And one day, someone chose to see me anyway." Belle glanced at her then, for the very first time. It was just a flicker, a momentary crack in the fortress wall, but it was enough. "You get one shot," Belle said quietly, her gaze dropping back to her drawing. "I know," Lena replied. Over the next few days, Belle didn't magically transform into a model resident, but she did stop cursing under her breath during mealtimes. She joined the group on a hike through the woods, though she walked at the very back, a solitary satellite in their small constellation. And on the third night, she laughed, a sudden, accidental, and utterly beautiful burst of joy during a particularly chaotic card game with Ethan and Edward. Lena noticed everything, but Edward noticed something else, too. "You see the way she watches you?" he said to Lena one evening as they were folding linens in the storage room. "She's suspicious," Lena replied, smoothing a crease in a pillowcase. "She's attached," Edward corrected, his voice soft. "Already. And in a girl like that, that's dangerous." Lena set down the towel in her hands. "You think I'm making the same mistake I made with the twins? Getting too close?" "I think you need to protect your own heart," he said gently. She nodded, but her gaze was resolute. "That's not what this job is about." "I know," Edward said, his own voice heavy with a new understanding. "But if you give her too much of yourself, Lena, and she leaves—" "She won't leave," Lena said, her voice filled with a conviction that surprised even herself. He looked at her, a memory of a past conversation in his eyes. "They always leave, Lena. You said that to me once, remember?" She stared at him, the weight of his words, of her own past, heavier than she expected. "Then maybe," she said, her voice a quiet, determined whisper, This time, we don't let her. The retreat continued. The teens painted murals on the community room walls, cooked group dinners, and slowly, hesitantly, shared their own stories in raw, painful fragments. Lena gave them space, never forcing, always inviting. By the last evening, the group had gathered under the soft, warm glow of lantern lights that had been strung across the garden. Belle stood in the shadows at first, her arms crossed, her head low. But when Lena began to speak, telling her own story of sleeping in strangers' homes, of being told she was too much, too angry, too broken to ever be loved, Belle stepped closer. "You talk too much," she muttered under her breath, but there was no venom in it. Maya smiled. "So I've been told." Then Belle said, her own voice so quiet it was almost carried away by the wind, "I used to draw birds, before, when things were better." Lena turned toward her. "You still can," she said gently. Later that night, long after the lights were out, Belle knocked on Lena's door. I don't want to go back," she said, her voice finally, completely, breaking. "To the group home, to anywhere else. This place, it doesn't feel fake." Lena stepped forward and placed a steadying hand on her shoulder. "Then stay," she said. "Let's find a way to make this your home." Belle nodded, wiping her eyes with the sleeve of her oversized hoodie. As she turned to leave, Lena whispered, "You're not too much, Belle. You're just right. And we see you." That, in the end, was all Belle needed to hear. Because sometimes healing didn't come in thunderclaps or dramatic epiphanies. Sometimes it came in quiet, simple promises, whispered through open doors in the dead of night. It started with a headline, a small, insidious blip in the corner of a local online news aggregator. But it was enough to send a cold, familiar shiver down Lena's spine. Local Millionaire's foster program. Under scrutiny. Allegations of improper staffing. Oversight loopholes emerge. The article itself was thin on verifiable details, but thick with insinuation and veiled accusations. It was a masterpiece of journalistic malpractice, citing anonymous sources close to the family and concerned community members who raised questions about the children's welfare. It painted the Hawthorne Williams Center as a well-intentioned but dangerously mismanaged vanity project, suggesting that Lena, as its co-director, was unlicensed and fundamentally unqualified to handle such vulnerable youths, and hinting, with a subtle, poisonous touch, that Edward was using his immense wealth to bypass state regulations and indulge a personal whim. Edward, when he saw it, was furious. "This is a smear job," he growled, his hands clenched into fists as he stared at the tablet screen. "Someone is deliberately trying to sink us." Lena, however, was silent. She read the article again, and then a third time, her fingers gripping the edge of the kitchen counter so hard her knuckles turned white. "It's someone who knows how the system works," she said quietly, her voice a low, dangerous murmur. "Someone who knows which buttons to push to trigger an investigation." CT. The next day, her fear was realized. Joseph Kim called, his voice tight with a frustration he couldn't hide. "Lena, I'm getting calls from the state agency. They're asking if you're operating with certified trauma counselors on staff at all times. They're asking if all your volunteer background checks are current and on file. This isn't just idle gossip anymore. It's turning into a formal investigation." Lena closed her eyes, a wave of exhaustion washing over her. "How bad is it, Joseph?" "Bad enough that they're talking about pulling the kids out of the center pending the results of their review," he said, his voice heavy. "Even Belle." That hit harder than she expected. "No," she said, her voice firm, resolute. "They can't take her. She's only just beginning to trust us. You need to fight this, Lena, Joseph sighed. But you need to do it quietly. Don't make it worse by going public. Just shore up your defenses, and do it fast. She hung up the phone and went straight to Edward's study. They're coming for us, she said, her voice devoid of any panic, replaced now by a cold, hard resolve. And if we don't get ahead of it, they will take the kids, the funding, everything we've built. Edward leaned forward, his own expression grim. We'll bring in outside consultants, independent auditors. I'll get Dr. Monroe to review every single one of our policies, line by line. But Lena, this is a hit job. It's personal. I know, she said. It's someone who knows us, knows our structure, our timeline, our weaknesses. Edward's jaw clenched. You think it's the Hollingsworths? No, Lena said, shaking her head. They wouldn't play it quiet like this. Their style is a full frontal assault in a courtroom. This feels closer, more insidious. Later that night, as a cold, biting rain lashed against the windows of the study, Lena sat alone at the large mahogany desk, going through the center's personnel and intake files, page by painstaking page. She was looking for a weak link, a mistake, something they had missed in their haste to get the program up and running. And then she saw it. It was in Belle's intake form. One of the signatures, that of the social worker who had supposedly signed off on the emergency placement, was slightly off. The name was correct, but the looping, elegant script was subtly, almost imperceptibly, different from the other signatures in the file. And the paper itself, she noticed, had been scanned and reprinted using an older model of printer, one that the agency hadn't used in over a year. Lena's heart dropped into the pit of her stomach. Someone hadn't just leaked a story. Someone had actively, deliberately forged a legal document and planted it in their files. She dialed Joseph immediately. This is going to sound crazy, she said, her voice tight. But I think someone tampered with Belle's placement file. There was a moment of silence on the other end of the line as Joseph pulled up the digital records on his own computer. Wait a minute, he said, his voice a mixture of confusion and dawning horror. Yeah, this isn't our standard file format. Where the hell did this come from? I don't know, Lena said, but someone planted it. Someone who wanted to give the state a reason to shut us down. Joseph was silent for a moment. Then you need to get ahead of this, Lena, he said, his voice firm. Now! The next morning, Lena called an emergency board meeting. Dr. Monroe, Lionel Pierce, Joseph, and Edward sat around the sunroom table, the tension in the room thick and palpable. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. She laid the forged document on the center of the table. This, she said, her voice clear and steady, is the weapon they are using against us, and we need to disarm it. Dr. Monroe frowned, her brow furrowed in concern. This is serious, Lena. If a state audit reveals a forged placement document, they will shut us down on grounds of gross negligence, even if we didn't know it was a fake. Joseph leaned back in his chair, his expression one of pure frustration. Someone slipped this into our system. They're targeting Belle because she's the easiest to discredit. If they can claim we failed her, they can unravel the entire center. Edward stood up, his own face a mask of cold fury. Then we don't give them the chance. We go to the press first. We tell the story ourselves. Lionel Pierce, ever the pragmatist, raised a skeptical eyebrow. You want to publicize a forgery in your own files? That's incredibly risky, Edward. Lena shook her head. Not just the forgery, she said. The truth. We tell them who Belle is, why she came here, and what she is becoming. Dr. Monroe looked at her, her expression one of deep concern. You would be putting that young girl at the very center of a media storm. I'll ask her first, Lena said. She gets to choose. That evening, Lena found Belle in the art room. The girl was working on a massive new canvas, a powerful image of a single golden bird, breaking free from a tangle of dark, thorny ropes. Can I talk to you for a minute? Lena asked. Belle kept painting. They're trying to send me back, aren't they? She asked, her voice flat. Yes. Belle didn't stop. Are you going to let them? Lena stepped closer. Not without a fight, she said. But we need your help. She explained the situation to Belle, carefully, honestly, without sugarcoating any of it. I will not put you in the spotlight unless you say yes, she finished. Belle finally set down her brush. She turned and looked at Lena, her gaze direct and searching. You told me once that I wasn't too much, she said. That I was just right. Lena nodded. Then let's show them who I am, Belle said, a small defiant smile touching her lips. Let them see me. The next day, Lena stood in front of a small, hastily assembled group of reporters on the steps of the center. Edward stood beside her, Joseph and Dr. Monroe behind her. And beside them, brave and centered, stood Belle. My name is Belle Harris, she said, her voice clear and steady as she spoke into the microphones. I am 16 years old. I have lived in 10 different foster homes in the last 4 years. I have been called unfixable, volatile, and dangerous. But here, someone saw me. Someone stayed. And I started to believe that I might matter again. Her voice didn't waver. I am not a case number. I am not a mistake. I am a girl who paints birds because for a long time I forgot how to fly. And now I am learning again. Lena stood tall beside her, her heart filled with a fierce, proud love. The cameras flashed, the questions came, but the tide had shifted. A truth, once buried, had a way of rising, and this time it came with wings. The immediate fallout from the press conference wasn't the explosive, catastrophic event Lena had feared, but it was relentless. For 3 straight days, the media, like a flock of patient vultures, camped outside the estate's formidable gates. Some reporters, the aggressive ones from the tabloids, shouted questions whenever a car entered or exited. Others, from more reputable outlets, just stood there, their cameras pointed, their microphones held aloft, hoping to catch a single, unguarded image of the girl who had, with her quiet, powerful testimony, cracked open a story no one in the gilded world of philanthropy wanted to tell. Belle, to her infinite credit, didn't flinch. If anything, the scrutiny seemed to galvanize her. She grew stronger, more centered. The center, in a stroke of strategic brilliance from Edward's PR team, released a digital gallery of her artwork as part of their official statement. Her powerful painting of the bird breaking free from the tangled ropes was shared thousands of times across social media, becoming an instant, unintentional symbol of second chances. Her simple, honest voice from the press conference echoed far beyond the local community, reaching state-level child welfare organizations and even a few national advocacy groups. Emails and messages poured into the center's newly created public inbox, from other survivors of the foster care system, from supporters, from skeptics, and from new, unexpected believers. But not everyone was kind. An anonymous, right-wing blogger, known for his attacks on social justice initiatives, posted Belle's sealed juvenile record, a clear and illegal violation of her privacy. Another online commentator, hiding behind a fake profile, called Lena a well-meaning but dangerously misguided fraud. Seat. And a national columnist, a man who had made a career of defending the status quo, wrote a smirking, condescending piece titled "Empathy is Not a Business Plan," questioning Edward's rash decision to entrust the futures of vulnerable children to a woman whose primary qualification seemed to be unstructured empathy. Lena absorbed it all in a heavy, weary silence. She read every word, every comment, every veiled threat. She did it not because she was a masochist, but because she believed you had to know the shape of the monster you were fighting. Then, one morning, a simple, handwritten letter arrived, addressed to her. There was no return address. Inside, on a single sheet of plain, lined paper, was a single, powerful sentence. "You saved my daughter when I couldn't. Thank you." It was unsigned, but it was enough. It was a shield. At breakfast, a fragile, new sense of normalcy had begun to take root. The boys were giggling over their cereal, engaged in a deeply serious argument about whether orange juice could, in a pinch, be used as a legitimate topping for pancakes. Lena poured herself a cup of coffee, the first she'd had in days that didn't taste of anxiety, and she smiled. A real smile. She thought, This is what's worth fighting for. Even the fire. Across the table, Edward folded the morning newspaper and met her eyes, a look of quiet, profound respect in them. "You're holding up," he said. "I have to," she replied simply. "It's not just for them," he added, his gaze flicking toward the boys. "It's for you, too." She hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "For me, too." That day, they held an all-staff meeting at the center. Every counselor, every mentor, every volunteer was there. Lena stood at the front of the community room. The weight of the past few weeks settled in her chest, but her voice was clear and strong. "I won't pretend that this hasn't shaken us," she said, "but I will not apologize for our mission. We did not build this center to look good. We built it because children are falling through the cracks in a broken system. And we, as a community, decided to stand in those cracks and catch them." The room was quiet. Then Dr. Monroe stood up. "We are with you, Lena," she said, her voice firm. One by one, the rest of the team nodded, some murmuring, "Always," and "Yes, we stay." That night, Lena walked the halls of the center alone. The walls were now lined with the children's drawings, with quotes from the teens, with a few candid photographs of their chaotic, joyful family dinners. She stopped in front of one, a picture of Ethan and Eli, their arms thrown around Belle's shoulders, all three of them caught mid-laugh. Home, she thought, the word a quiet prayer, captured in a simple 5x7 frame. In the East Wing art room, she found Belle working late on a new mural. It was a sprawling, ambitious cityscape, but unlike the dark, intimidating skylines of most cities, this one was filled with windows that glowed with a warm, golden light. "You're still here," Lena said gently from the doorway. Belle shrugged, wiping her paint-stained hands on a rag. "Can't sleep." "Are you okay?" Belle paused, her brush hovering over the canvas. "Yeah," she said. "Just thinking about what happens next. People think that just because I stood in front of a bunch of cameras, I'm fixed now. But I still get mad, you know? For no reason. I still don't trust people easily. I still—" She trailed off, the words unspoken, but hanging heavy in the air. Lena sat down on a stool beside her. "You don't have to be finished to be free, Belle." They sat in a comfortable silence for a while, the only sound the faint, rhythmic hum of crickets from the garden outside. Then Belle said, "You think I could ever, I don't know, speak at schools? Talk to other kids like me?" Maya smiled. "You just did, Belle. To the whole world. And yes, you are more than capable." Belle grinned, a rare, brilliant flash of pride beneath her carefully guarded expression. "Then I want to do that," she said. her voice filled with a new, quiet purpose. I want to be the person I needed back then. The next morning, a call came from a representative of the state's Child Welfare Committee. "We have been reviewing the Hawthorne-Williams model," the woman on the other end of the line said, her voice formal but not unkind. "It's unconventional. But the preliminary outcomes are undeniable. It's working. We would like to schedule a meeting to discuss the possibility of replicating your approach elsewhere in the state." Lena sat frozen at her desk, the phone pressed to her ear. "You're saying you want to expand our program?" "We're saying," the woman replied, a note of admiration in her voice, "that we want to learn from it." After she hung up, Lena stared out the window for a long, silent moment, her thoughts spinning. It was bigger than her now. It was bigger than all of them. Later that week, Lena, Edward, and Belle sat with the boys under the great oak tree. The air smelled of cinnamon and dry, fallen leaves. Ethan was reading aloud from a children's book, pausing every few sentences to let Eli, in his infinite creative wisdom, make up wildly imaginative alternate endings. Belle listened with a quiet, contented smile. "I want to write a book someday," Eli said suddenly. "About kids who fight bad guys." Lena ruffled his hair. "Start with the truth, sweetie," she said. "That's always the best story." Edward leaned back against the rough bark of the tree trunk, his hand brushing lightly, intentionally, against Lena's. She didn't move away. The sun dipped lower, casting long golden lines through the branches. They were all so different, all of them broken in their own ways, all of them reassembled and stitched together with the threads of shared pain and a hard-won, rebuilt hope. But they were whole, not because they had erased the cracks in their lives, but because they had chosen, together, to fill them with gold. Kintsugi. Lena had read about it once, the ancient Japanese art of repairing broken pottery with a lacquer mixed with powdered gold, silver, or platinum. The philosophy was that the breakage and repair were part of the history of an object, rather than something to disguise. That's what they were doing. And maybe, just maybe, that's what healing really was. A choice made every single day to stay. Lena didn't recognize the man at first. He was tall, gaunt, and dressed in a cheap tan blazer that seemed a size too big for his thin frame. He stood by the community center's bustling front desk like a ghost. A man who didn't know whether he belonged in the warm, chaotic light of the room or wanted to retreat back into the cold, gray shadows of the street he'd just come from. His face was partially obscured by a worn, faded baseball cap, but something about his posture, a familiar, nervous energy, stirred something buried deep in her chest. It was Dr. Monroe who finally, gently, waved Lena over. "There's a gentleman here who says he's here to speak with you," she said, her voice a low, cautious murmur. He wouldn't give a name. Lena approached him cautiously, a polite, professional smile fixed on her face. "Can I help you?" The man looked up, and just like that, 20 years of carefully constructed walls collapsed into dust. "Lena," he said, his voice weathered, uncertain, a sound she hadn't heard since she was a child. "It's me, your father." Time stopped. She heard, first, a rushing sound in her ears, a thrum of pure, unadulterated disbelief, and then, in her chest, a cold, profound stillness. "You don't get to say my name," she said, her voice so low it was almost a hiss. I know," he replied quickly, his hands coming up in a gesture of surrender as he took off his cap. His hair was mostly gray now, his eyes bloodshot and haunted. "I shouldn't be here. I saw the press conference on the news. I saw you. And Lena, I had to come." She stood frozen, the joyful, noisy chaos of the center fading into a dull, distant roar. People moved around her. Kids laughed in the nearby playroom. A counselor called out directions for a trust-building activity. The world kept spinning. But inside her, something fundamental had cracked. Edward, who had just arrived to pick up the boys, sensed the shift in the atmosphere instantly. He saw Lena's pale, rigid face, saw the strange, trembling man before her, and his own protective instincts kicked in. His gaze shifted between them. "Is this man bothering you, Lena?" he asked, his voice a low, quiet growl. Lena didn't look away from her father's face. "No. Yes. I don't know." "I'll give you two some space," Edward said quietly, but he didn't go far. He stood by the doorway, a silent, watchful guardian. "I'm not here to ruin anything," her father said, his words tumbling out in a rush. "I don't want money. I don't want anything from you. I just wanted to see if you were okay." Lena let out a slow, sharp, steadying breath. "You left when I was 10, she said, her voice flat, devoid of the emotion that was raging inside her. "You left when Mom had her first breakdown, when everything, absolutely everything, fell apart." "I was sick, Lena," he whispered, his own voice a raw, painful rasp. "I was an addict. I was lost. I didn't know how to stay." "That's not an excuse," she said. "It's a fact," he countered. "A miserable, ugly fact. But it doesn't erase what happened. Or what didn't happen." He nodded, a deep, profound shame curling his shoulders. "I missed your whole life." "You forfeited it," she corrected, the words clean and sharp as a scalpel. They stood in a heavy, painful silence. Then he reached into the pocket of his worn coat and pulled something out. It was a photograph, bent at the corners, faded and softened by time and countless viewings. It was a picture of a little girl in denim overalls, with two messy braids and scraped knees, holding a sketchbook and squinting into the bright summer sun. It was her. "You left this on the front porch the day I drove away," he said, his voice thick. "I've kept it all these years. It was the only piece of you I had left." Lena's throat tightened. The photo had been taken by a neighbor on a summer day she barely remembered. She had forgotten it even existed, but seeing it now felt like being punched in the memory. "I'm trying to get clean," he said, his eyes pleading with her. "I've been sober for 2 years now. I'm working at a garage outside of Baton Rouge. I see a counselor. I go to my meetings." Lena crossed her arms over her chest. "And what do you want from me? Forgiveness?" He looked at her, his eyes glassy with unshed tears. "No," he whispered. "I want grace." The word hit her differently. Forgiveness was a transaction. It was earned, negotiated. Grace. Grace was a gift, offered freely, or not at all. "I can't promise you that," she said, her voice softer now. He nodded, his gaze dropping to the floor. "I understand. But," she added, her own voice surprising her, "I can promise not to hate you anymore. And that's something." A single, slow tear finally slid down his weathered cheek. "That's everything," he whispered. Lena didn't tell the boys about the encounter that night. She didn't tell Belle, or Edward, or even her mother. She needed time. She needed to file the raw, unexpected experience away. Like a fragile, ancient document you're not ready to read, but can't bring yourself to throw away. Instead, she went home, cooked dinner for the boys, helped Eli with his math homework, and read Ethan 2 chapters of their favorite mystery novel. Then, when the house was finally quiet, she sat in the sunroom with Edward, the fire crackling softly in the hearth. "He came," she said quietly. Edward looked up from the book he was reading. Your father? She nodded. It was like, it was like talking to a ghost. A ghost I've been angry at for so long, I forgot I was still haunted. Do you want him in your life? He asked gently. I don't know, she said honestly. But I think, for the first time, I wanted him to see me. All of me. That's all. Edward reached across the space between them and took her hand. You're seen, Lena, he said simply. She rested her head against his shoulder, and for the first time that day, the violent tremble in her heart began to still. 2 days later, Belle came bursting into Lena's office at the center, her face alight with an excitement Lena hadn't seen in her before. She was holding a flyer. Look, she beamed. My first speaking invitation. A youth advocacy panel in Atlanta. They want me to talk about the role of art in healing from trauma. Lena grinned. That's amazing, Belle. When is it? Next month, but I'll need a chaperone. Lena raised an eyebrow. And you're asking me? Belle smirked, a flash of her old, defiant self. Well, I trust you not to let me eat 3 gas station burritos in a row. Flawed logic, Lena said, laughing, but very flattering. Then Belle's expression turned serious. I'm nervous. That's good, Lena said. It means you care. Belle looked at her, her eyes filled with a guarded, fragile hope that Lena knew so well. Thanks, she said. For, for seeing me, even when I couldn't see myself. Lena touched her shoulder. That's what light does, Belle, she said softly. It finds the cracks and gets in anyway. And in that moment, Lena understood something new and profound about her own journey. Healing didn't always mean forgetting. It meant integrating the brokenness into something fuller, stronger, and more real. It meant letting go of the things you couldn't change and holding on, with fierce, unapologetic tenacity, to the things you could. It meant becoming the kind of person who could offer grace, not to excuse the sins of the past, but to free the future. And it meant finally, fully, standing tall in your own name. Lena Williams, mother, mentor, healer, and no longer haunted. 6 months had passed since the blur of the custody hearing and the subsequent, quiet revolution it had sparked. The sprawling gardens of the Hawthorne estate were now heavy with the lush, extravagant blooms of late spring, and the center, once a mere concept, buzzed with the vibrant, purposeful energy of its new, expanded program calendar. It wasn't perfect, but it was thriving. Lena, who had been officially named the center's youngest-ever lead counselor, had started weekly art therapy sessions with Belle, sessions that were yielding breathtakingly honest and beautiful work. Ethan had moved up a grade in school and was, to Edward's astonishment, acing his spelling tests. Eli had announced his intention to invent his own team of superheroes, the Kindness Avengers, complete with hand-sewn capes and a solemn oath to help all the sad people. And Lena, well, Lena watched them all grow, like a patient, devoted gardener who had finally learned how to root herself in hope. That morning, a bright, clear Saturday, dawned with a sense of celebration. Edward had invited the board, the staff, and their families for a small, informal gathering under the great oak tree to mark, as he put it, 1 year of staying. A simple, hand-painted banner, made by the twins, was strung between 2 branches, its letters a little wobbly, but its message clear. Lena arrived early to help Mrs. Keller arrange blankets and lemonade glasses. She paused by the banner, a soft smile on her face, remembering the first, shaky version of the house rules they had taped to the refrigerator what felt like a lifetime ago. Now, the idea of their unconventional family felt familiar, comfortable, like belonging. The guests began to arrive, a happy, eclectic mix. Dr. Monroe, Joseph Kim, a beaming Lionel Pierce, Lena's mother Lorraine, and dozens of staff members from local social service agencies filled the chairs that had been scattered around the lawn. The children from the center's programs sat in a boisterous circle on the grass, twirling the paper lanterns they had made. Edward, looking more relaxed and happier than Lena had ever seen him, stood to speak. "When we first named this center," he began, his voice clear and steady, "we were trying to marry two seemingly impossible odds: the cold, hard reality of wealth and the warm, soft power of empathy. But I've come to understand that the real miracle of this place isn't the programs we've created or the funding we've secured. It's endurance. It's the quiet, courageous choice someone makes every single day to show up, even when no one is watching." Lorraine stood then, her presence unexpected, but certain. "My daughter," she said, her voice thick with an emotion she no longer tried to hide, "taught me more in the last year than I ever gave her a chance to learn in her entire childhood. I am honored to be here today, not as a bystander, but as someone who is still, thankfully, growing." Ethan and Eli then marched forward with solemn purpose, each holding a small, smooth, gold-painted rock. They placed them carefully at Lena's feet. "This rock is gold because it's brave," Ethan said loudly. "And this one is gold," Eli added quietly, "because it stays." Lena swallowed hard, the hot sting of tears swelling behind her throat. Edward stood beside her, his hand finding hers, as the twins presented their simple, profound gifts. Joseph Kim cleared his throat next. "We have just reviewed our 6-month outcome reports," he announced, his own voice filled with pride. "Schools are reporting increased attendance and fewer behavioral referrals from our kids. But more importantly, we are seeing kids who are learning to trust again." Dr. Monroe stepped forward. "And we are expanding. We are in the process of securing 2 more sites, with Lena at the helm." Lionel Pierce, his usual cynical demeanor completely gone, raised his glass of lemonade. "To the woman who didn't ask to be part of a family," he declared, his voice booming across the lawn, "she built one anyway." Lena blinked, her hand gripping Edward's tightly. He squeezed hers in return. As the crowd began to mingle, Belle approached Lena, her sketchbook in hand. Inside was a new, stunningly beautiful drawing. It depicted 4 golden trees, each a different shape and size, each leaning in toward the center, their branches intertwining as if they were holding up something greater together. Beneath it, in Belle's neat, elegant handwriting, were the words, "This is what growing looks like." Lena kissed her on the cheek. "Yes, baby," she whispered. "This is exactly what it looks like." The late afternoon sun cast long, peaceful shadows as the crowd began to thin out. The twins ran off to play tag. Lorraine lingered beside Lena under the oak tree. "I'm proud," she said softly, her gaze following the boys. Lena nodded. "Proud is different than forgiven," she said gently. "But you're here." Lorraine reached for her hand. "And I want to keep showing up, Lena." She leaned in and rested her head on her mother's shoulder. Edward found them there and draped a warm arm around both women. "Let's plant something," he said. "A new flower bed, maybe. Roses." Lena's lips curved into a smile. "Only if we promise to tend to it. Every week." He laughed. "Deal." That evening, Harold, the butler, brought them all refills of lemonade. The happy, tired laughter of children drifted across the lawn. The faint, sweet scent of jasmine settled over the estate as dusk folded the day into its gentle embrace. Later, when the last of the headlights had disappeared down the long drive and the center was quiet again, Edward found Lena in the sunroom. She was sketching out a new set of rules with Ethan, these labeled community rules. The words were simple: trust, kindness, bravery, presence. He closed the door softly. "I wanted to ask you something," he said. She looked up, a question in her eyes. "Would you marry me?" he asked, his voice quiet, steady, a sound that wasn't a proposal as much as it was a promise. She didn't answer at first. She closed her sketchbook and pressed it to her chest. Then she said, "Yes, but only if you know that I am not, and will never be, perfect." He stepped forward and brushed a stray curl from her face. "Neither am I," he said, "but I think we're better at growing together." And outside, the wind rustled through the leaves of the great oak tree, as if it were congratulating them with its ancient whispering approval. Because healing, they had learned, had become their inheritance. And family, they had discovered, was built not by blood, but by 1,000 small, everyday actions, all of them wrapped in gold. In that moment, Lena Williams felt both rooted and, for the first time in her life, like she was flying.